Thanks, Lavanya. So, hi everyone. As Lavanya mentioned, I'm Hita. I am currently based at the University of Sheffield at the Urban Institute, and some of the work that I'm going to be talking about is slightly older work of mine because my current work really revolves around community energy in Africa. That being said, this is the working group on water governance, and therefore water it shall be. Uh, a lot of my work employs historical methods. So that kind of explains some of the title of my work. Have largely looked at water systems in India. So that's also some of what I will be talking about today. Right. So talking of India, I center a lot of my work in the city of Bangalore. It's a South Indian city. It is what most people outside of the country would know as the Garden City of India. It's also known as the IT capital, which is the information technology capital of the country. Uh, so typically when something goes wrong with your phone or some other device and you call your customer service, there is like a massive chance that you're going to be speaking to an operator based out of Bangalore. So in Bangalore is one of those infrastructure information technology capitals of the country. But Bangalore is also very interesting beyond these various identities that it holds. It has a very interesting history. It is a landlocked city, as you can see on the map in front of you. It has no major water body that provides water to it. It is at a very high elevation. It's situated in the rain shadow of the Deccan Hills, and therefore it is prone to aridity. It is also interesting in the sense that it has grown by engulfing its rural peripheries. Today, it is known as a megacity, but at the same time, it has grown by engulfing its rural peripheries, which means that the idea of the urban and the rural, or the dichotomy of the urban and the rural that we see in cities or generally in landscapes, is kind of blurred in this region, largely because the rural periphery has been engulfed into the city fabric, which means right in the heart of the city you will find things like an information technology park, which is basically a fancy way of saying that there are a bunch of IT companies situated in the same compound, um, alongside a paddy farm, both thriving and doing their own thing in the heart of the city. So like I said, there is a gradient of urbanity. There is also a gradient of urban temporality in the region. There are other interesting aspects. So it is in the south of India, as you can see in the map that I'm showing. There's an elevation gradient. It was an important site for various kinds of purposes in the colonial period, which kind of lasted from 1799 to 1947 in this particular region. And most of that colonial period of what is it called, of authority, was centered around two distinct zones. So the city was divided into two distinct zones. There was a British cantonment, which was governed by the British. And then there was a native pete, which was the agricultural industrial hub of the native city, governed by the native rulers of Mysore, with whom the British had an agreement of subsidiarity through something called the Act of Rendition of 1881, I think, if I'm not mistaken. The landscape is semi-arid, it is landlocked, there is no primary water source. But this is also a very interesting site because it has been a site of continuous occupation since about the 4th century CE. Now, why is that so? I mean, how can a city thrive when there is no major water body? And how can it thrive for such a long period of time, right? So that's where the lakes come in. Remember, I told you there was an elevation gradient. The landscape is also, naturally filled with depressions and so on. And so early occupiers of the city, early planners of the city made use of this particular geographical feature of the city to construct a series of reservoirs that are rain fed and networked across that elevation gradient. So water would fill up in one of these lakes and flow down to the next, thereby creating a system of flows. So the city was transformed from being an arid non-water flowing kind of landscape into one where a system of flows was created. Therefore, thus supporting agriculture, which was then the primary source of income for people there. It was also the primary source of water for centuries until the advent of long-distance water transfer, with the advent of electricity, so on and so forth. But also because in most places, water holds a certain sacrality to it, right? In this region, the only source of water is the lakes, and therefore these lakes have long histories of socio-cultural associations. They were seen as religiously important. They were seen as as critical to supporting the life and livelihoods of people, both the economic as well as the cultural fabric of these regions was supported through these lakes. Of course, they have changed in distribution over time, which means that what you see on the screen right now is what it currently looks like, or at least looked like as of 2017, 2018. But if you look at older maps of the city, this concentration of water bodies was so dense. In fact, one of the early planners of the city, early British planners of the city, Colonel Sankey, after whom several things both in the UK and in India are named. There's a document in the Indian archives which basically I accessed, and where he says that there is no square inch of land left within which to construct another lake. So they were that widespread in this region. And of course, because their decline has been so distinctive, they also evoke a sense of nostalgia about what constitutes a water body, and so on and so forth. So in my work, I use a number of things. I use historical maps, I use historical records to draw out what are the official narratives of change in these regions. I do field interviews where I've spoken to people, mostly the most vulnerable communities, as to what their relationship with the lake has been like over time and what that has meant for their lives and livelihoods. I've done a lot of oral histories, semi-structured interviews, but I also have, I also do a certain amount of mapping. So what I'm presenting together is probably something that comes from all of these different methods that I use. So I told you that Bangalore was governed by two distinct regions. So if you look at this particular map, this initial map that I showed you, the little box on the right shows you what colonial Bangalore looked like, which is that small little thing that I have marked in the center of the map there. That's the colonial extent of the city. The city since has expanded, as you can see, beyond those boundaries. But given that we are looking at historical data, data availability is largely found only where the city center was. And therefore, my study area has usually been that colonial boundary of Bangalore. And as you can see, what you can see here is that there is a massive change in the distribution of lakes between the various years that you have maps for. So that's 1885, 1935, 1973, and 2014, which was something that we did using fieldwork. And as you can see, the number of lakes has drastically declined from about 40-50 lakes to about 2 or 3 lakes. But what's also very interesting is how that change has happened concomitant with changes in agricultural areas. So all the green patches that you see on these maps are agricultural patches, cultivated area. And you can see how water bodies are concentrated, and they're concentrated around water bodies, but also that there is a network of wells, that's open wells, that which are those little dots in those maps that are associated again with those green spaces, right? Now, there is a reason for this. These lakes these are seasonal, they are rain-fed, and therefore they will dry out in the summer, which means that for sustainable agriculture to happen in that region, which was an agrarian landscape, there had to be an alternative source of water. Now, the lakes by themselves recharge shallow aquifers, which were then tapped into by constructing these many open wells that served as a secondary source of water for people during the summer months. So now you can see that lakes, wells, and agriculture formed a very, very tightly coupled system around which that landscape developed. As urban land cover increased, so this was through the rise of public institutions, this was through the rise of educational institutions, and so on and so forth, in both the native city and the cantonment. That meant that the area for agriculture became scarcer and scarcer. And with that, also the need for the wells and the lakes became lesser and lesser. And that's at a broad overview. I shall talk about specific changes a little later. And so you can see how concomitant with the increase in built-up cover of the landscape, you saw a decline in wells, you saw a decline in water bodies, you also saw a decline in the more provisioning dependencies that people have with water bodies, essentially agriculture. So that's this broad scale picture. And now I told you that the city relies on long distance water transfer. The city now relies on water that is pumped upstream from a river that's 100 kilometers away. What do these changes then mean for the resilience of the city? So these are some of these questions that I've been grappling with, and form the larger body of the work that I do around water governance in the city. And very, very broadly, the various narratives that emerged were how the discourses around water bodies changed from something that had to be protected and maintained to something that could be polluted, drained, and converted into other forms of public infrastructure. And all of these changes were concomitant with the changes in resource use, which is essentially the necessity for water to irrigate farms and crops. So essentially, water was definitely a contested resource, according to all of these archives and broader literature. There are specific contexts of change that seem to matter. So why did certain lakes get protection? Why did certain lakes become drained for disease maintenance? Why did certain lakes become seen as vectors of disease, and so on? And there are these various, each lake had a different story. So what we felt was there was a need to study these cases in depth to get at those specific contexts of change. I will focus on one of these lakes, which is the Dharmabuddhi Lake in Bangalore in India. This was a paper that we published in Urban Geography, and what we saw really through our broad perspective of studying lakes and their loss in Bangalore was that there was also a very big driver of change, which is the notion of sanitary cities, which is the notion that native cities were not particularly the epitome of cleanliness in a certain sense, and that Western-centric ideas of health and hygiene were somehow more superior to native ones. And therefore, there was this one-size-fits-all solution that was then imposed on the landscape. So what we were interested in was to look at, and often in very racialized ways. I think that's a key point. The fact was, it was seen as the sanitary city was a governance project that was seen to sort of reinforce the divides between the colonial and the native populations, between the us versus them. And so we were kind of interested in looking at what this meant to colonial and native administrations. Because as much as we talk about water is an urban infrastructure, something that is integral to the project of urbanization. But urbanization itself has larger agendas. It has agendas of domination. Even today in the modern world, it has agendas of domination. Who belongs to the city? Why are they said to belong to the city? What constitutes a city? The ideas of modernizing, the idea of nation building. So urbanization itself is a broader project. And where do these socio-technical processes that we're talking about influence such domination, and what does that mean for the urban poor? What are the long-term consequences the social ecological system change in the context of such vulnerable populations? So that's the kind of broad thing that we were broad overview that we were trying to look at. So we focused on one particular lake. This particular lake was called the Dharmabuddhi Lake. The earliest mentions of it were probably in the 5th or 6th centuries, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And it was one of the biggest lakes in the native part of the city. And today it is the city's bus station. So the central bus station. So today when you enter Bangalore, if you enter Bangalore either through rail or through bus, this is where you're going to land, at the Majestic bus station. How did this change? How did what was a water body change into this bustling bus station. And what did those narratives tell us about this larger project of urbanization? So that's what we were trying to look at. Now, we quickly realized when we looked at this particular transformation, we quickly realized that we are not telling the story of one lake. We are telling the story of a system of lakes that was connected by multiple channels. Remember, I told you that the lakes of Bangalore were connected through an elevation gradient, right? How did those connections happen? Through stormwater channels. And if you see the maps that on top of the screen, you will see how this one lake that we're talking about was connected to at least 10 other lakes in that region through an intricate network of lakes, and how between 1885 and 1973, those connections, which basically fed the water system, the system of flows that was engineered in Bangalore, began to be reappropriated for various other purposes. So sometimes you had railway lines being built over a stormwater channel or under a stormwater channel. Sometimes you had buildings being built over it, and so on and so forth. But essentially, by 1973, which is the third map on your screen, you had basically 3 or 4 lakes out of those 10 or 15 lakes, and none of them were connected to each other. The systemic connections between those lakes had disappeared. And so we traced the process. What were the things that happened there? So we could see how 1877, there was regulated grazing of cattle around the lake beds. So the lake beds obviously had grassy patches, and that was an important source of fodder. There were annual boat festivals, so there was this cultural element to it. But by 1882, the city was stuck in the grip of a famine. There was also plague and epidemics at that point of time. But the biggest challenge was that of famine and drought, and the fact that all of these various channels that connected the lake were slowly beginning to disappear. Now, this meant that the lakes, which were once full of water, did not have as much inflow of water into some of them, or some of them caused flooding because there was too much water going into them. What that meant was effects were felt on the entire system of lakes, leading to conflicts, water shortages, but also this proposition of, like today, technocratic solutions. Let's divert a river. Let's divert, let's build an entire reservoir and divert a river there. That way we can solve water problems of the city. These are all very familiar narratives to us even today. In this era, the technocratic solutions were, let's build more lakes. Let's see if we can build more channels around the lakes. Let us see if one part of the lake can be rejuvenated from other lakes, or can we just connect some of the other lakes further? None of these worked, because that infrastructure that enabled those connections was already being built over, and that caused issues of a dry lake. And the lakes began to dry up. There was no fish. People suddenly began to realize that they had to pay for commodities like water, which was a big thing. They never had to do that. But there was also another overarching concern that emerged. There were sanitary concerns. We have a water body which was part of a system of flows was now becoming stagnant. What did that mean? That meant mosquitoes. That meant rats. That meant anything and everything in between, which could add to this issue of famine and drought by causing other diseases such as cholera, plague, and so on and so forth. The issue of technocratic solutions continued into the rest of this region's history. In a certain sense, people started digging individual wells by about 1892 to tap into whatever little groundwater was left. But also there was the first long-distance water transfer from a lake that was way up north in the city. And that continued into the present day. We moved further north until we started receiving water from a river that's 100 kilometers upstream by pumping water into the city. Meanwhile, what happened to this particular lake that we are interested in? It became a swampy marsh. There was loss of life. There was plague. And essentially what that meant was we had a water body that slowly transformed from being integral to the community into one that was seen as harmful to the community. People started moving away from the region, and so on. By about 1920, this lake was drained as a part of a malaria eradication program, and the ground began to be used to conduct public events, which eventually then transformed into a bus station. Now, what you see here is this gradual transformation of one form of public infrastructure into another form of public infrastructure, driven, of course, by the fact that there is this project of urbanization that was transforming these infrastructures into other forms of public infrastructure, but also aided and abetted by this notion of the sanitary city. Yeah. So what are we seeing here? We saw the initial impetus to change as having emerged from loss of connectivity and famine, leading to a dying water body, resource shortages, famine and drought, spread of epidemics, and impacts on lives and livelihoods. But then this initial impetus created a particular perceived need for further infrastructure. So there were different kinds of responses. There were technocratic responses, some of which I have mentioned already. The policy level responses, for example, it was said that there's very little water in the lake, therefore you cannot let your cattle drink water from that lake. There were individual responses. Someone filed a petition at some point saying, hey, look, this lake is drained. Can I appropriate that to build a house? There were collective responses. There were communities that said, okay, now this lake doesn't have any water. Can we have a cemetery built over here? Those kinds of things. But all of that together, the interplay of all of these factors caused migration, a loss of cultural dependencies, a loss of provisioning dependencies, creating what was essentially a disconnected marshy area with a need to repurpose into other forms of infrastructure. This is not new to Bangalore. It has been true of many other places. But of course, there were long-term consequences. Even today, when you look at this place, every time it rains, you see pictures on the right that tell you what that landscape looks like. There are long-term consequences in terms of flash flooding, in terms of water availability. Bangalore was one of those cities that was posited to run out of water by 2030 or 2050 or something. The same time that Cape Town was posited to run out of water, Bangalore was one of those as well. So there are these very long-term consequences. But the other thing that eventually came out of this whole work was the fact that here's a landscape that sits in the native part of the city, but has been governed through what is essentially a polycentric regime. And I shall explain that in a little bit. But you had the native rulers being governed by the British overlords, and all of them exerting influence on a landscape that is ostensibly native in its composition and origin, and support certain needs of that landscape, such as agriculture and so on. And so it was a very interesting governance strategy as well. So we were trying to look at what does that mean in this landscape in colonial Mysore, which was the state that Bangalore belonged to at that point of time. So this is something that's in review right now, but we were essentially conceptualizing this whole system as a polycentric regime, and we were saying that polycentricity is something that is interpreted differently across different loci of power. And so we kind of go to this particular paper that Tiffany Morrison had written, which is this idea of power in polycentric systems. So there's the power by design, there's pragmatic power, there's framing power, each of which operate differently in different landscapes. And so that all of which contribute together towards the polycentric governance model. We basically looked at polycentricity as operating in this landscape. Like I said, Bangalore was part of the colonial state of Mysore, which you can see in the map to your right. Now there were different regions in this state, which were very interesting. So our argument is that polycentric regimes can be hegemonic. They can be empowering as well as disempowering. And one example in which this is very evident is the colonial imperial project, which basically set out ideas of the West versus South, racial segregation, sanitary cities, which is a form of racial control exerted through the idea of health and hygiene, control and order, centralization. All of these were projects of the colonial agenda. And which also created certain very ambiguous pockets of governance, one of which was in Mysore. And this was created because of the Act of 1881, which split the region into a distinct native region and a Pete region. The native region and the cantonment region. So the native region was called the Pete, which is the native city, and the cantonment, which is the British Europeanized part of the city. Of the city. So Bangalore was one such ambiguous pocket of governance. But if you look at it, the whole state of Mysore, you had Mysore, the state, its capital, which was also a city called Mysore, which was entirely governed by the native rulers who were called the Vadeyars or the Wadeyars. Then you had Bangalore, which had this ambiguous governance where part of it was native, part of it was British, and then you had the rest of the city of the state, which were players in the governance landscape, but not as important as Bangalore or Mysore were. So this was a landscape that we felt was polycentric, given we are talking about semi-autonomous decision-making centers and so on and so forth, all the classic definitions of polycentrism. And the reason we say this was, but what we argued was there was a shift in the nature of polycentricity in these regions. So from something that was more bottom up into a very top down form of polycentricity. And that's what I'm trying to show in this picture. So before 1799, before the colonial agenda set in, we had the ruling monarchy who governed multiple villages around the water body. But the water body itself was governed by multiple locally crafted institutions that were aimed at various aspects of local life: water management, the associated commons, the religious purposes, other social interactions, and so on. And that was a kind of resource system governance model that was followed before 1799. In 1881, after the rendition of Mysore, this changed drastically. So you had two distinctive forms of governance. So in Bangalore, which is on the left side of the figure to the right, you had the British Empire. You had its colonial outpost, which was a residency, represented by the resident of that residency, who governed the cantonment, which is the British part of Bangalore, who crafted colonial institutions that were municipal, agriculture, revenue, public works, all the very modern names that you see, who then liaised with village institutions to govern the lakes in Bangalore, or the resource system governance. On the other side, you had the British Empire, which had as its subsidiary the native rulers of the Wadeyars, who was represented by his prime minister, called the Diwan of Mysore, who then worked with city corporations and the native crafted institutions, also now renamed as municipal agriculture revenue in keeping with the broader colonial agenda, who worked with village institutions to govern resources both in Bangalore and in the larger state, right? So you had this very, very strange way of polycentric governance operating in this landscape. And then you had contact between the resident and the Diwan of Mysore. So it's a very top-down sort of model of polycentricity that this landscape changed into. So what we did was we were interested in, clearly there is an agenda that is driving urbanization in these regions. What was that agenda and how did it percolate across these different decision-making units at different levels of this hierarchy? That was a kind of question that we were trying to answer. And so we looked at speeches as a way to unpack this. So we looked at official speeches that were made by the king and the Diwan of Mysore. And then we looked at basically we screened them for mentions of Bangalore and Mysore, and then mentions related to tanks and water, and then ended up with 47 bits of text that formed a chronology of ideas surrounding what water was to these places and in the minds of these people, that which we call imaginaries. So going into the results, there were different kinds of speeches. A lot of this, I guess, is very similar to what you would see even in today's speeches or governance reports or whatever. So you have promises of infrastructure, monetary support, grievance support, and so on. You had reports of finances and budgets, or even the activity itself. There were descriptions of general conditions within the state, economic challenges, comparisons with other cities of the state, a vision for the future, and so on. There were recommendations for the direction that a city should go to, but there was also commendation for activities that were undertaken by citizens or a municipal board. And then here comes the interesting bit. Now, remember I told you that the king was the figurehead. He was represented by his prime minister. Now, if you look at where the speeches were conducted, the king conducted about 17 of those selected speeches, 10 of which were in cities that were not Bangalore or Mysore. Essentially, he was present in the not so important regions of the state. And the Diwan, on the other hand, had 30 speeches, mostly made in Bangalore or Mysore, and following certain patterns, as I shall show you. Then we looked at, all right, there might be differences in the number of speeches, but what are they trying to say in each of these regions? And that's where it was even more interesting. We saw that each of these places had distinctive narrators. In Bangalore, which was also a colonial outpost, I see a chat message. Oh, okay.
You have 5 minutes, Hita. Sorry.
Yeah. I think that'll be fine for me. But essentially, if you see the city of Bangalore, which was also a colonial outpost, there were promises that both the king and the prime minister made. There was a report of activities that were undertaken. Note that there is literally no mention of finances anywhere in this place. In Mysore, on the other hand, which is the capital of the native city, there were a lot of reports and descriptions, not so much promises, but the reports were often very economic, especially when undertaken by the Diwan. There was a distinctive economic framing to these reports. So it was, we spent so many lakhs of rupees on doing this for you. That was a kind of thing that was being told in these regions. In other cities, on the other hand, as is very similar in cities even today, there was a promise of infrastructure, monetary support, but there was also a description of economic challenges within the state. We'd love to do this, but you should understand that we are in war. You have to be self-sufficient yourself. That was a tone in which these reports were made. And that was very interesting, because what we saw was, there were different ideas of what constitutes modernity, technology, and modern ways of thinking in each of those different areas. And by this, I mean recommendations such as, should we use piped water, or should we encourage people to dig their own boreholes? And in Bangalore and in Mysore, it was, we should have spent so much money, or we have provided you with piped water in these regions. But in other places, it was, other places have become self-sufficient in water governance. Why don't you dig your own boreholes? So there are different ideas of what constitutes what are the necessity components of urbanity, depending on the places in which those speeches were being made. But there was also differential reproduction of both the sanitary and economic discourses in Bangalore, Mysore, and other cities of the regime. By this, I mean that there were two different kinds of discourses. There were the official discourse. There was health, sanitation, and modernity and economic concerns, but the way it was percolated down into the recipients was very different from the way it was framed at the agenda of the British Empire. In a certain sense, what we saw was how the native prime minister co-opted the tools of the urban of the British agenda into driving certain imaginaries of the native state into the populations that it was influencing. What was, however, absent was the fact that all of these landscapes are culturally intertwined, and there's this big link between utility and sacrality. Official discourses completely missed these dynamics that were present on ground. And what did that really imply for water commons in each of these types of cities? If you look at Bangalore, I've shown you what happened in terms of the cities, in terms of the lakes there. In Mysore and other states also have similar narratives. And this really basically talks about, I mean, the question really is, what does that mean for urban commons? And even in the present day. Very quickly, this also was an exercise of power. The spatial locations of the speeches mattered as much as what the content of the speeches. There were different urban imaginaries in various contexts, but there was a subjective understanding of what the colonial ideology was into society by those lower in the hierarchy. There was a reproduction and divergence of colonial dialectics while making use of colonial technologies and ideas. So, for example, the idea of piped water, it was definitely seen as something that was desired in both the native and the colonial agendas, but it was used to drive an economic agenda within the state of Mysore, for example. And so then the question emerged as to where was power concentrated in this polycentric regime? What is the role of smaller cities, and so on? My last slide, I think this is. So essentially, there were a bunch of things that all of these different stories tell us. One, people are different. The idea of a homogeneous community is definitely a myth. Whether we are talking about governance systems, whether we are talking about bureaucracies, whether we are talking about collective action, this idea that communities are the same is a myth. Urban commons are influenced by a range of top-down as well as bottom-up processes that influence them through both time and space. Some of these are related to colonial instruments of oppression. Others are state-led discourses of welfare. But in all of this, the same groups of people become marginalized over and over and again. It is the people who depend on these spaces for lives and livelihoods. Whereas the urban rich, the ultra rich, as well as those who see the landscape merely as a tool for aesthetic and recreational purposes, are the ones who get the most decision-making power in any landscape. Therefore, what is needed is a shift in thinking from communities as monolithic blocks to groups of diverse individuals, each with their own wants and needs, and to recognize historical inequities and their systemic roots before addressing them through policy and practice. And with that, I end. Thank you.